Where did we end? We ended with the revivals, and we talked about how those revivals had those four elements that, conversionism, activism, biblicism, and crucicentrism, or as more ably than I did, Laurie said, it's about the cross. So that's what it is. Right away, after those revivals, evangelicalism started to fragment somewhat. And this is going to be pretty much the story as we keep going, because that's why I use the illustration of a tree with roots that go down to Reformation and Pietism and Puritanism. That would be the roots. But then the main trunk is what evangelicalism is. But then it starts to branch out a little bit more. And that happened very early on. In the early part of the 19th century, evangelicalism moved in literally three different directions in terms of, I don't know whether I'm on or this, maybe I should. Are you still hearing me? I will stay close to this and we'll dispense with the noose, as I want to call it. Geographically, it began to disperse in three different areas. Well, first, it was in New England, so we could say that it stayed in New England to a degree among the Congregationalists that I mentioned. But we can basically just write these guys off almost immediately because they claim to be the heirs of Jonathan Edwards, and they really weren't. If you know the history, Harvard was founded in order to train pastors. Harvard went south. Yale was founded to pick up the task of training pastors. Yale went south. A couple of other Ivy League schools followed in the wake. Princeton, we will have to mention a little bit later on, actually became the heir after that. Princeton College, then University, and then Princeton Seminary as an offshoot of that. But that's the history of education. Keeps going south. When I say south, I don't mean geographically south, although I'm using geographic terms now. But the idea of revivalism kind of fizzled. It was Calvinistic and sadly went sort of ossified, as one author says. They just sort of lost it. And what happened there was really evangelicalism died very early. I had a colleague at Moody that was from in New Hampshire, and he said, they haven't had an evangelical there since they were wearing buckles on their shoes and three-cornered hats. So then there were the Presbyterians. Again, the Presbyterians were believed in revival, but here comes another crucial term. They resisted revivalism, as we're going to see. Now, I'm going to make a distinction between the revivals, which again were the surprising works of God that he used when you had people preaching the way Whitefield preached directly from the Bible. You were preaching for conversions, but it was really the work of the Bible, it was work of the Spirit that brought about those conversions, so it was still a quote-unquote surprising work of God, to use Jonathan Edwards' terms. The Presbyterians were again further south, more in the middle colonies, and they were more interested in education. They started William Tennant started the Log College, and then out of that became other schools. And then again, as I said, Princeton came out of that. But then another feature came up, this thing called revivalism. And revivalism happened in two, some people say three, but I'll limit it to two distinct geographical areas. One was the West. Now, when we're talking about at this particular time, this now is the early 19th century, the West was Western New York State. Okay, that was the West, okay? And then there was another area, it was actually really was geographically further west, but it was more south in the Tennessee, Kentucky, Cumberland Valley area. And that wasn't just the West, that was like way out west, okay? South and west. And two different types of revivalism happened there. Let me talk about the Cumberland Valley, the Tennessee and Kentucky type of revivalism that happened there. This happened among those who were Methodists in part, some Baptists in part, and some Presbyterians, although less Presbyterian than these others. What they had were these what called camp revivals. Now, at this time, that particular area, Kentucky, Tennessee, places like that, even a little bit further than that, maybe Ohio, really, that's why I'm getting out there. But they would have the camp meetings. Think about a geographic area where the population is really widely diverse. They're out there. And they would have, I was told that this church was at one time a union church because, again, there were so many different denominations. There weren't enough people to have individual congregations, so they came together. These camp meetings were kind of on the same idea where they'd bring in people from a very wide geographic area. They'd have to come in by their carts and their wagons, ride their horses in, and they would come. They would advertise these camp meetings, and this would be basically their summer vacation, if they had such a thing back then. And they would all come in, and it would be really, talk about intensity again. There would be 10, 15, 20 speakers over the course of just one day. I mean, there would be no break. A man would preach, sometimes 2 hours at a time, and then someone else would get up right after him, and then he would preach. And they had these very high-intensity camp meetings again that they were called. One of the most famous was the Cane Ridge Revival, organized by a guy named Barton Stone, that became known as America's Pentecost, because what happened in these meetings was, again, the emotional intensity sort of broke bounds outside of just seeking people to have an emotionally strong conversion into just emotionalism again for its own sake. And people would begin to sort of have these strange manifestations of sort of reactions to things. And the Cane Ridge Revival, not the start of Pentecostalism, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but those kinds of revivals had, again, a number of consistent features. The preaching there, now think of biblicism, think of our term there, the preaching there relied much less on the Bible and much more on what I was talking earlier about these pointed applications, these kinds of things where you deviated from the Bible, but you were telling very pointed sort of applications to people, moralistic sermons more than anything else, but with a very pointed sort of point to them. They were not very doctrinally sound, but they, again, were very emotionally moving, and they were not preached by people that had had any sort of pastoral training, and this became sort of, again, a hallmark of that particular area, where anybody that had a call to preach could just start preaching, whether they were actually trained for that or not. So think about this. People had skills of oratory, but very little in the tank exegetically from the Bible or doctrinally that way, could get up and you can imagine the kinds of doctrinal deviations that were sort of introduced, but nobody there to stop it. I mean, it just kept the meeting going on. And that very quickly deviated into a number of different areas and ways. Most of them, fortunately, died out as a lot of those 19th century religious movements died out. But some of the methods continued on. But where I really want to spend a few more minutes here before we can take some big leaps, and that is to talk about what was happening in the West. I mentioned Western New York. What happened there is, now I'm going to give you honestly what is my opinion on it, not just mine alone, but others have a much more favorable view of these developments than I do and others do. But it came to be known as the Second Great Awakening. And so in Western New York and places like that, sometimes northern Pennsylvania, but mostly Western New York, the Second Great Awakening happened. And the Second Great Awakening is centered on the work of one particular individual whose name is Charles Grandison Finney, F-I-N-N-E-Y. Finney was one of these guys that, again, although he was in Western New York, very much like the fellows in the South we were just talking about, decided that he was called to preach. what footnote here, what you discover a lot of times is people that take the church or evangelicalism in a false direction are lawyers. And he started out as a lawyer. Okay? Are there any lawyers here? Okay? I don't want to offend the lawyers, but you know what Shakespeare said. First, kill all the lawyers. Okay? But it was like the lawyers, because he had a very legal, organized legal mind. Is the idea of how to accomplish things is a very sort of put out the pattern, follow the instructions, and then you'll arrive at the conclusion. And Finney, he studied with another Presbyterian preacher for a while, but then decided that this guy wasn't moving fast enough and decided to go off on his own and started having these revivals. Now he called them revivals, but this is where I use the term revivalism. And the key work, or the key method that Finney used, were something called the new measures. And he introduced the new measures. Now, again, footnote here. I want to warn you, I'm probably going to step on some toes here coming up, but I hope you got, you're not wearing sandals. It's not going to hurt too bad. But what happened was Finney introduces this new measures. Again, highly emotional preaching, but emotionalism for emotionalism's sake. Rather than emotionalism as something that is response to the preaching of the word, this is emotionalism that's ginned up. This is emotionalism that's created. This is emotionalism that is somebody manufactures. This is, as one author said, conversionism on rails. Finney didn't think that you had to wait for God to work. Finney said we could produce conversions just like we could produce anything else if we just used the right measures. And he introduced the new measures. And those new measures included things like, again, this emotional preaching, but with not just an application, but a sort of psychological twist. I doubt that these measures would work on any of us who have seen the 2 million commercials on television that we have seen over the years. I mean, when somebody says something that is new and improved, do you believe that it is new and improved? I believe the box says new and improved on it, if that's what you mean, but I don't believe it's new and improved. And how many people actually think you get the gas mileage on a brand new car that they're telling you you're going to get on this brand new car? I mean, and I could give you hundreds of examples. When I was a kid, I remember there was a thing in cereal that would give you a little plastic submarine that you put baking soda in, and it would go up and down in the bathtub. And I got that thing. It sank like a rock and never did. And then one day, my mom pulled the plug. It went down the drain in the tub, and it was gone forever. I've been scarred, and I don't believe anything ever since. But the point is that he used those kinds of psychologically manipulative measures that we now know as advertising in order to get people converted. Well, think about that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, are they genuinely converted? He introduced something called the anxious bench. And the anxious bench was like it sounds. It was a bench that was down front. And through this emotional preaching and the highly intensely psychologically manipulative techniques that he was using, if people were getting anxious, they could come down and sit on the bench. They would even have some people moving through the congregation, encouraging people, look, you're weeping, you're crying here. You need to get down to the anxious bench. And they would, here it comes, come forward. So come forward to be converted. Come forward, sit on the anxious bench, and then, we'll manipulate you a little bit more on a much more personal basis in order to manufacture these conversions. Now, theologically, underneath this, Finney said that's how it works. Basically, he was a moralistic preacher who thought that man could pull himself up by his own moral bootstraps. That you decided anytime you wanted to be saved or be converted, that was up to you. It was totally up to you. And the Presbyterian notion, or the Calvinistic notion that, by the way, this would be something even Wesley would have agreed with as a Methodist, that you have to depend upon God for this, Finney said, well, of course not. You can manufacture. You can get people saved. You can see that people are getting saved because, again, when he would use these methods, people would come forward. They would sit on the anxious bench. They would make a profession of faith. And then Finney would notch them on his spiritual gun belt and then move on to others. And it became a system of counting the noses. How many people do we get forward? How many people can we sort of make sure that they're drawn forward? Now, again, I want to put a footnote in. If you came from a tradition, and when I was first saved, that's something we did, have people, come forward and that sort of thing. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but the problem comes in getting people to think that by coming forward is how they're getting saved. That this is somehow, even sometimes in some fellowships, a necessary step. That unless you've come forward, that we don't even know that you're saved. And then you're just reminded if you start to have a struggle with assurance. Well, you came forward, did you not? I mean, you came forward. You remember that. So just don't forget you came forward, as if that action is something that is necessary or even effective in seeing people converted. So you can see, back to my 4 points, what Finney did is redefine the definition of conversionism. He redefined the definition of a conversion. A conversion is when God works on a heart in such a way that that person responds to the work that God's already done in their heart. It's not us. It's no longer I, but Christ lives in me. It's not something that I've done, but Christ has already worked. The Spirit has already worked. Then the activism then switches from seeking, the activism has a different definition as well, right? So the activism isn't out there evangelizing. The activism is, can we keep manufacturing these things? So the definition of activism changes somewhat as well. So now the activism isn't be active in evangelism. Activism is the act of producing these conversions. And expands then to conversion becomes moral improvement. And then to keep that going in the lives of these people, think about it. If some were genuinely converted, of course, their lives are going to change, as we know, by the Spirit of God. But if they're not, but we still have to see moral improvement, then what has to happen? Well, now we have to start whipping them into shape, making them conform. And so the activism starts to take on a sort of legalistic notion of how we're going to make sure that these people continue on. These all have profound theological implications. But in terms of this, in terms of what was happening among evangelicals, is that this revivalism then becomes something of a standard way of operating. Well, tell it not in Gath, publish it not in Ascalon, lest the uncircumcised Philistines hear. But that morphs into the ministry of another great 19th century American evangelist, a guy named D.L. Moody. Now, Moody, when he shows up on the scene a number of years later, let me tell you D.L. Moody's story real quickly. D.L. Moody, by the way, didn't know that much about Finney and frankly didn't know that much about the Bible, but that was okay with D.L. Moody. He knew people who did. Moody was a businessman, or if you're from Texas, businessman. He did business, and he sold shoes in Chicago. He was converted in his uncle's shoe store in Boston. He was from Massachusetts. Made his way to Chicago, which was the place where young men went. And now that was West by this time, by the middle years of the 19th century. And he goes to Chicago to sell shoes. But he wants to be active in terms of reaching people, but he's not well educated. He doesn't speak well. He's good at selling shoes, but not much else. But in Chicago, he sees all these, kids running around. These urchins that were, maybe their families don't care where they're at, or maybe some are orphaned. So he starts organizing a Sunday school in Chicago for all these kids to come to. And he just gathers them. First, he started, think about this. He'd get 50, 60 kids off the street, and then go into the first high church of high-collared, respectable people and bring all these kids in, and they're saying, you can't bring all these kids in here. This is a church. What do you think we're here for? he started his own Sunday school. That Sunday school then grew. He started working with the YMCA in Chicago at the time. That's another offshoot of evangelicalism, the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, which was in those years genuinely about seeing young men come to faith in Christ. And that then becomes his full-time job. He stopped selling shoes. And then he'd never done, no training, nothing. He never preached. He just had an opportunity to start preaching to these kids. Then adults started coming. Again, maybe some of the parents of these people. This is all very lower class, working people. And he's speaking their language so they understand him. And then some businessmen in town, Cyrus McCormick, the guy that built the Reaper, not the Grim Reaper, but the harvested crops. He starts backing Moody with some money, he and the YMCA, and Moody starts preaching even more. Long story short, he gets to know some people who come over from England to see what's going on in Chicago. And a couple of them make offhanded comments, well, you need to come to the UK and do the same thing there. So, again, Moody, not really sort of understanding all of the ins and outs of this, decides one day, I'm going to go to England. So he gets ready to go. He takes a guy named Ira Sankey with him, who's the music guy that sort of created songs. And he's already kind of developed the first, iterations, the starting of how he's going to do his revivals, his meetings. And he does a few in Chicago, but then he shows up in England, and he starts showing up to these people. Hey, you told me to come. And they said, well, we didn't really think you would do it. So, so they said, well, so he's tried to start some things. And again, here, the Lord did really bless. And he starts these meetings. And again, here's this American, probably because he spoke really funny. He spoke bad English, but then to the English, we all speak bad English, so they didn't hold that against him. And he starts preaching in his style, and his style was, he was a springboard preacher. He'd bounce on a text a couple of times, and then he launched into, the pool. And then from their point, he's a skyscraper preacher. You know what a skyscraper preacher is? One story after another. And these are all very compelling stories. And you got to remember, this is the 19th century, the Victorian era. It's a very maudlin, sort of sentimental era. And he told very maudlin, sentimental stories about young men that grew up in a Christian home and then went off and became wastrels, but then came to the end of themselves. The prodigal son iterated in a variety of different ways. And the people in the UK loved it. And they flocked to hear him preach. And he made a whole circuit through the UK and back down to London. By the time that was over, he was famous no one really knew him outside of Chicago. But by the time he got done with that, he gets back to the States, and he's well known. He's got invitations from cities all over America, Kansas City, Des Moines, Iowa, really west now, and back to the east. He didn't want to go back east because he knew that they would know that he doesn't talking well. So, but eventually he did, and Moody begins. But what begins this amazing career of starting these meetings, but it's tinged again with the same things from Finney. He knew that if they had some really compelling songs for everybody to sing, they could sing these songs. He could tell these stories. He could get people to make professions of faith, and then that would just bring in more interest and more money. By the way, Ira Sankey wrote songs from scratch. He was writing songs all the time, little hymns. Sometimes you might see them in modern hymns. They took those hymns and they put them in a book and they sold them. And they said, this is selling really well. Maybe we could do some more. So they took some of Moody's sermons that had been highly edited and put those in little booklets and started selling them. And then they said, well, maybe we could sell some other sorts of things. So they started selling them. And out of what was called the Chicago Coal Portage Society, then the Moody Coal Portage Society, it's just publisher, became Moody Press. And I'm sure you've all heard of Moody Press, now Moody Publishers. My book is published by Moody Press. I always say at Masters, my hope is built on nothing less than MacArthur's Notes and Moody Press. So actually that's changed with the different study Bibles that have come down the year. And then out of his ministry then comes the Moody Bible Institute, Bible College, and we'll come back to that later. But you can see so the revivalism has now become something of a production, okay? One more quick reference to that line of individuals was in the early years of the 20th century. So some of these lectures are going to go back and forth. The early years of the 20th century, there was an individual named Billy Sunday. And that was his real name, by the way, Billy Sunday. And Billy Sunday was a baseball player for the Chicago White Sox, which actually then becomes the Chicago Cubs later. It's confusing. But nevertheless, and Billy Sunday, he takes it up to the next level. His meetings were like Barnum and Bailey sideshows. They did all kinds of crazy stuff. Billy Sunday would, because he had been a baseball player, would come running down the center aisle of the place, and he would jump on stage and slide like he's going into second base. And then he'd say, if you thought that was a great slide, Jesus would have done it even better. And he just launches into all kinds of stuff. A great showman. And he takes his traveling show in a tent. They called it a tabernacle, and he went around, and it becomes very, very sort of the standard way of doing things. And then a guy I'll come back to again later today that you probably all really know well, his name was Billy, and there's few people that only need one name, okay? And if you just say Billy, everybody knows who Billy was, Billy Graham. And Billy Graham had a more sophisticated version of this same pattern of revivalism that started with Finney. So Finney, Moody, Sunday, Billy Graham. Now, was it wrong? Well, did it produce conversions? Well, yes and no. Some. Louis Zamperini, you ever heard of that guy's name? The very famous guy. He was saved at a Billy Graham crusade. My mother-in-law claims to be saved at a Billy Graham crusade or from Billy Graham's. So were there people genuinely saved? Yeah. Were there a lot of false conversions as well? You have to be honest, yeah. And the activism now has changed from being active in just evangelizing to be active in these mechanical sort of revivalism. By the way, I should give credit where credit's due in all of that. There's a book by Ian Murray, again by Banner of Truth, and that's the title of the book, Revival and Revivalism. And what happens in revivalism, let's move on, the biblicism gets weakened. So in revivalism, you can see it started again, I said, with the Cane Ridge meetings, and then back to Charles Finney, and then as this goes on, the connections to the Bible become more and more tenuous. So the connections to doctrine become more and more tenuous. So you get to the point where that doesn't really count that much anymore, as long as you're still getting conversions, as long as you're still getting professions of faith. And there, in and of itself, I suppose you could sort of a lot of people would argue, well, look, there was a lot of good that came from that. People did get saved, even though there might have been some false professions. The problem with that is weakening the biblical base means that you've just opened the door to something else, and that's where we're going to kind of go next. So the biblicism gets weaker, and the cruciocentrism gets weaker too. One more development that happened in the 19th century in this progress before we move on is, by the end of the 19th century, evangelicalism begins to change again. Different branches start to develop. And because of this weakening of doctrinal clarity, because of this weakening of people who are converted, I'm a Christian, and they wouldn't necessarily have a Bible basis for that, but they'd make a profession of faith on the basis of their emotionalism. That opened the door to two developments. One is liberalism, that I'll come back to, and the other one is the social gospel movement. Evangelicalism through the 19th century, again, the activism had morphed and changed into, first you have genuine conversion, then with Finney, you had a sort of moral reformation that was self-generated. Then from moral self-reformation, you had social reformation. And early on, a lot of evangelicals would have identified with movements like the abolition movement, okay, good, against slavery, the temperance movement, against alcohol, all right, still, got some pros and cons to it, but basically good, to then other progressive interests like, fixing society and changing, people's moral behavior by agencies and movements that would change that. Until finally it morphed into, again, something called the social gospel. And a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch, and Lori will tell you how to spell that later. So Walter Rauschenbusch and several other people, he's the big name in terms of the social gospel. And basically the social gospel was essentially, look, what good does it do to get somebody converted and ready for heaven if they're still living in squalor down here? We need to reform their lives now, and not just wait for a reformation or some, pie in the sky and the sweet by and by. We need to do something now. So the social gospel movement came in and identified itself. It just so happened that this is going to sound real familiar this afternoon. In the secular world, in the political secular world, there was a movement going on called progressivism. And don't get ahead of me. When I say progressive today, that's got one connotation, not completely divorced from this connotation of the progressive movement. We're going to improve society. And that was, by the way, a bipartisan movement because Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive, even though he was Republican. And then they had others who were progressives, and they would have been Democrats. But progressives were that, look, we got to improve society. And they did. They did improve some things. I mean, they had, they made the government go in and make sure that meat packing plants were clean. They started regulating food and drugs, so you couldn't have snake oil salesmen selling things that actually harm people rather than help them and that sort of thing. So the progressive movement had some good things. That tied in, again, with temperance movement of that nature. But you see, what that did is that took that activism in an entirely different direction and siphoned off the vitality from evangelicalism. So put two things together, a weakening of grounding the message in the Bible and grounding the what we're doing and why we're doing it in the truth of Bible doctrine to what does society need and what should we be doing about it, and does doctrine or do those kind of things even count? Now, the other development that happened in the middle years of the 19th century was liberalism. I think Dr. Busenitz might have talked a little bit about this from what I've heard, but let me talk about how the branches begin to fragment even more. Very quickly, let me talk about the development of liberalism. If you're familiar with this is not British, so I'm back over in the UK very briefly. If you're familiar with the life and ministry of Charles Spurgeon, you know that there was a particular point in his ministry later on that he called the Downgrade Controversy. And the Downgrade Controversy was that he was in the Baptist Union, but not just in the Baptist, but in churches all through the UK and the United States. They were on what he called the downgrade, like a train going down, just picking up speed. And the source of the downgrade was the rise of higher criticism of the Bible. Now that had its roots, again, we mentioned this earlier, in the Enlightenment. It was when the Enlightenment came in and philosophers like René Descartes and others said, we need to just use reason. We need to just use reason. Let's not use the Bible. Let's bring reason to the Bible. And if it's not reasonable to us, then we'll reject the Bible, or we'll just take the parts of the Bible that we like. Liberalism, higher criticism said, look, Moses could not have written the first 5 books of the Bible, and as far as creation in 6 days, I mean, come on. Charles Darwin has shown us that that's not the case. And other sorts of things. Axe heads floating, are you kidding me? Axe heads floating in the days of Elijah? Or let's just cut to the chase. A man who was clinically dead, crucified on a cross in the tomb for 3 days, rising from the dead. Who can believe that? It must have been a spiritual resurrection. We must spiritualize all these sort of things. And so you had the rise of criticism of the Bible. The Enlightenment said apply reason. So what's left? Well, don't forget what I mentioned a moment ago, the direction that Finney took the revivalism in the States was not based on the Bible, but based on this emotionalism. So how do you know that you're genuinely converted? Well, you had an emotional experience. So your faith is based on your feelings. Well, guess what was happening back in Germany at the time? There was a guy named Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher. Again, or you're getting this down, right? And the reason why I used all of his name, Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher, is because it took me a long time to be able to say Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher without messing it up. Okay, so I understand. Schleiermacher developed a religion of feelings. He said, that's it. Christianity is a religion of feelings. How do you know it's true? He even called it the feeling of absolute dependence. Whatever that is, it's just some amorphous sort of feeling that you have. And liberal theology said, in reaction against the rationalism of the Enlightenment and the higher criticism, said, well, we don't just want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, that there's something good in Christianity, or to change the metaphor, there's a kernel inside the husk that's good. And so what we need to do is clean off the husk and get down to the kernel. And the husk is all the stories and all those kind of things. The kernel are the moralistic teaching of the Bible that increases your feeling of absolute dependence. And as far as cruciocentrism goes, Schleiermacher said, it doesn't make any difference if he died on the cross or not. The fact is, he did it with feeling. Whatever he did with feeling. I mean, Jesus isn't our Savior. He's just the guy who had the feeling of absolute dependence, like really big. And we can learn from him. And by the way, again, hope I'm not stepping on too many toes here, but this is the genesis of the red letter edition of the Scriptures. Well, why do we have Jesus' words in red? Because they're more important than all the other words. They're Jesus' words. So let's put the real important words in red, so then you don't have to read all that other stuff. Just go to those red words, which, by the way, don't work, because in the Sermon on the Mount, if you read this, and there's one place in the Sermon on the Mount where it's Jesus speaking and it's in red, and then in parentheses there's a little statement there that says, let the reader understand, which I don't think Jesus would have stopped. Clearly that's Matthew, putting his, let the reader understand what Jesus is saying. But nevertheless, I always tweak everybody, who's got a red letter edition. I don't think that's it. That comes from liberalism. And one more name, Albert Ritschl, R-I-T-C-H-L, Ritschl, and he basically said, well, it's not just feelings, it's again back to that moralism. So really the core of Christianity, the kernel of Christianity is just moral teaching. So we're back to then, don't forget, where Finney ended up was really what we're trying to do is self-reformation, moral self-reformation is what what Christianity is about. So it's ironic that the revivalism in the 19th century in America was patterning a development that was happening over in Germany, and those two things got together, and there's where you get liberal religion and liberal congregations. We don't have to believe what the Bible says. We shouldn't believe what the Bible says because our reason tells us not to. And what we should be talking about is, do we have a good feeling about this? And are we improving people's moral lives? And that's what Christianity really needs to be all about. Well, we're just on the cusp of a very big development here. And that very big development is going to be sort of what happens when Bible-believing Christians, people who have been genuinely converted by the Spirit of God, born-again Christians, are in denominations in which this higher criticism and this liberal theology is beginning to take over. So what are you going to do? And what we did was the Fundamentalist Modernist controversy. So we're actually now up, believe it or not, after only 2 sessions, to the 20th century. And I got 3 hours left, and more than I can actually get done. But we do have time. I understand it. I'm not using up my 4 minutes right now, okay? So remember, I'm reserving these 4 minutes. So here's any questions? Right, Aaron's got a microphone this time. So if anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask. Way in the back, Aaron.
So we know the dangers of hierarchical church structures like Catholic, Orthodox, etc. And you've described very well the dangers, not just from the evangelicalism, but Protestantism. So can you comment on this? Pros, cons of the hierarchical structure versus what we have in the various Protestant traditions? Any hope of any ecumenism? When might Christ bring this church back together, etc.?
Okay. Very good question, because, again, it's sort of one of the rivulets of streams that I really didn't include in my notes here, but it's a very good question because it goes along. So let's go back to the fact that Biblicism, reliance on the Bible, is now replaced by emotionalism, frankly. Okay, so where's the authority then? The authority for theology, I teach my students, is the Bible, of course. For liberal theology, the authority is in the feelings, in the feelings of absolute dependence. And in some circles, you would say, well, the authority for the Bible would be in the Roman Catholic Church, in the hierarchy. So that's where the authority comes from. So we don't have to think. It's just what our priest says. You can see how that development happens is because there must be some authority. There must be someone that says this is how it needs to be done. There must be somebody who is telling you what is the truth and what's not the truth, because your feelings are just too, imprecise. So that's where the hierarchical structure comes in, like in the Catholic Church and in other hierarchies too. So this is what, in some hierarchies, in fact, in the older Methodist churches, they wrote the sermons back at headquarters and sent them out to the churches, so they knew that every single Methodist church was hearing exactly the same message delivered from the pulpit. And the guy there wasn't writing sermons; he was just like a talking head on television. Only now it was behind the pulpit live. Again, the problem with that is that if your hierarchy is biblically based, it can work. But if it's not, and often it's not, then it doesn't work, and you get a deviation in doctrine, and then that affects all the other things we're talking about here. It's a funny thing about evangelicalism is that, as we're going to see when we get into fundamentalism in particular, is that there was no denomination and there was no hierarchy. What we're going to see with the interesting thing with fundamentalism is it seems pretty fragmented, but it's really interesting. We're still the inheritors of that strain of conservative evangelicalism and fundamentalism, because I don't know what you use for hymns or hymnals here, but if you look at the average sort of Bible teaching church hymnal, it's going to have a lot of the same hymns. I mean, right now, you can't swing a dead cat without hearing somebody whistling a Getty tune on the campus of. That's an old expression, by the way. I don't actually swing dead cats, but everybody's doing Getty tunes now. Everybody knows those kind of things, and why is that? Even though we're all, these people are over here. We're independents. There's some Baptists over there. There's some Southern Baptists. There's even some Presbyterians, and we're all singing the same hymns. Where does that come from? We're all reading the same books. Same publishing houses, and again, not so much anymore, but years ago we were all listening to the same radio preachers and that sort of thing. So you asked about ecumenism. I said a humanly manufactured ecumenism will either fail or be deleterious to true biblical doctrine. Ecumenism that's manufactured, that we try to do. But an ecumenism that's based upon everybody that's indwelt by the Spirit of God, like somebody going up to a piano with a tuning fork, and it will resonate. So true biblical Christianity resonates. Doesn't make any difference to the denomination. Doesn't make any difference to the geographical region. I mean, this is the kind of thing when I go internationally and I start preaching, people, in different places, they get it. I mean, you know, that liberal churches in the States wouldn't get, but they get it in Thailand or they get it in the Philippines. They appreciate biblical preaching there. That's true ecumenism, but that's spirit-generated ecumenism. We shouldn't be trying to manufacture. And again, I'm an unapologetic advocate. I believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, and you want to when's it all going to happen? Then, okay, we're all going up, and I can't wait for that day. I hope I'm near some post-tribulationists when it's happening, so I can point at them. Here we go. But don't know that I'll get the chance to do that or even want to at the time. But so yeah, does that answer it? I mean, you know, human-generated ecumenism, not good. Spirit-generated ecumenism, I think we see it all the time, one way or another. All right, I think we're over time. Maybe I'll use one of my 2 minutes if anybody else has a question. Sorry. Anybody else have another question? Quickly. Now you got to run clear over here, Aaron. So, you know, I'll try and make this quick here. Go ahead. There's your microphone.
I just wanted to know, it's a quick question. I wanted to know if you'd ever heard of the chaplain of Bourbon Street, Bob Harrington. I heard him back in Baltimore where I grew up. He was just a curious guy.
Oh yeah, I've heard of him. I mean, you know, again, this is. I'm 68 years old, so I've heard a lot of those kind of things. Not only have I studied, but I've heard of him and quite a few others. So